The Duke, who could not walk, rose to his feet when the maiden whispered his name. The air in the carriage was stale with the scent of damp wool and dread. Alara clutched the worn handle of her valise, her knuckles white against the cracked leather. Outside, the skeletal fingers of late autumn trees clawed at a bruised sky, their branches dripping a ceaseless, mournful rain onto the muddy track. Each turn of the wheels brought her closer to Blackwood Manor, a place spoken of in her village only in hushed, fearful tones. It was the lair of the beast of Blackwood, the broken Duke Alastair, a man shattered by war and entombed in his own colossal grief. And she, Alara, daughter of a tenant farmer whose harvests had failed for 3 consecutive seasons, was to be his new companion. A sacrifice, her father's desperate eyes had told her, for their survival. The carriage lurched to a halt before a fortress of gray stone that seemed to consume the light. Gargoyles wept streams of rainwater from the ramparts, their grotesque faces frozen in silent screams. A severe, rail-thin housekeeper with eyes like chips of flint led her through halls that echoed with a profound and unnerving silence. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge the simple weave of her cloak, the undisguised poverty in her bearing. There were no fires in the grates, no flowers in the vases. The entire manor felt like a mausoleum, cold and devoid of life. She was brought to the Duke's study. The room was a cavern of shadows, dominated by a vast desk of black oak and shelves of leather-bound books that climbed into the gloom. And there, beside a window streaming with rain, he sat. Duke Alastair was confined to a wheeled chair, a heavy tartan blanket draped over his legs. His face, when he finally lifted it from the book he was ignoring, was a masterpiece of cold indifference. It was a handsome face, carved from granite, but marred by a thin, silver scar that cut a severe line from his temple to his jaw. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, held no warmth, no curiosity, only a deep, abiding weariness. He was a ruin, magnificent and terrible. "Miss Alara Vance," the housekeeper announced, her voice sharp. The Duke's gaze swept over her, a fleeting, dismissive assessment. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, rough with disuse. "Leave us." The housekeeper vanished, the heavy door closing with a sound of finality, like a tomb being sealed. The silence that descended was heavier than stone. Alara stood, her hands clasped before her, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was a lamb in a wolf's den, and the wolf was watching her with an unnerving stillness. He did not ask her to sit. He did not welcome her. He simply existed, a monument to sorrow and bitterness. The Duke, who could not walk, rose to his feet when the maiden whispered his name. The thought, a line from a foolish ballad, felt like a cruel joke in the face of this harsh reality. Her duties, as outlined by the flint-eyed housekeeper, were suffocatingly simple. She was to read to him, for his eyes, the woman had claimed, were often strained. She was to manage the household correspondence his infirmity supposedly prevented him from handling. She was to be a presence, a quiet fixture in the suffocating gloom of his existence. In the first days, she felt more like a ghost than a companion. She would read aloud from dry histories and philosophical texts, her voice the only sound in the vast study, while he stared out at the rain-lashed grounds, his profile immobile, unreadable. He never commented, never looked at her. Alara, however, was not forged of brittle stuff. She had known hardship, and it had tempered her with a quiet resilience. She would not be broken by silence. She began to push back against the oppressive darkness of the manor, not with words, but with small, determined actions. Each morning, she would pull back the heavy velvet drapes in the study, allowing the weak morning light to spill across the dusty floor. He would flinch, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "I prefer the dark," he stated once, his voice a blade of ice. "And I, your grace, prefer not to go blind reading your letters," she had replied evenly, her fingers steady on the cord. He did not argue further, though the thunder in his brow was unmistakable. She began to notice things. She saw the formidable strength in his shoulders and arms as he propelled his chair through the long, echoing corridors, the muscles cording with an athlete's power. She saw how his hands, when resting on the wheels, were not the pale, delicate hands of an invalid, but the calloused, capable hands of a man who knew labor. There was a coiled energy in him, a tightly leashed power that contradicted the stillness of his lower body. Pity was a luxury she could not afford, and an insult she would not offer. Instead, a seed of profound and dangerous curiosity began to grow within her. Who was this man, truly, behind the mask of the broken duke? One evening, a violent storm, born of the unforgiving sea, threw itself against the manor. Wind howled in the chimneys, and rain hammered the ancient stones. Elara was in the great hall, attempting to coax a reluctant fire to life, when a young footman, startled by a deafening clap of thunder, dropped an entire armload of logs. They scattered across the flagstones with a series of loud cracks and rolls. The boy froze, pale with terror, expecting a fearsome reprimand. Before Elara or the flustered housekeeper could react, there was a whir of wheels on stone. With a speed that was both shocking and graceful, Alistair maneuvered his chair across the hall. He did not summon a servant. He bent from his chair, his movements fluid and powerful, and began to gather the fallen logs. His long fingers closed around the rough bark, stacking the wood with a methodical precision. Moved by an instinct she did not question, Elara knelt beside him to help. The firelight cast dancing shadows over his intent face, softening the hard lines. As she reached for a piece of silver birch, her hand brushed against his. It was a fleeting touch, skin against skin, but a jolt, sharp and undeniable as a lightning strike, passed between them. His head snapped up. His stormy eyes met hers, and for a breathtaking second, the glacial walls around him shattered. She saw not a duke, not a cripple, but a man, startled, vulnerable, and utterly lost. A flicker of heat, of something akin to panic, flared in his gaze. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his mask of cold indifference slamming back into place. He finished the task in terse silence, then wheeled himself away into the shadows, leaving Elara kneeling on the cold stone, her fingers tingling, her heart hammering with a new and terrifying awareness. The crack in his armor was a revelation. Haunted by that moment of unguarded connection, Elara began to explore the neglected corners of the manor. Her search led her to a vast conservatory, its glass panes clouded with grime, its interior a graveyard of withered plants. Yet, in one corner, a single, magnificent orchid struggled for life. She recognized it from a botanical text, a rare and precious specimen. An idea took root. She would bring this place back to life. It was a task, something to fill the hollow hours, a way to cultivate beauty in a place starved of it. She spent her afternoons there, cleaning the glass, turning the soil, tending to the forgotten flora. The work was hard, her hands becoming chapped and sore, but it was honest. One afternoon, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see the Duke in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. She expected a curt dismissal, an order to cease her meddling. Instead, he wheeled himself inside, the chair crunching softly over scattered leaves. "You are using too much water for the phalaenopsis," he said, his voice gruff. He gestured with his chin toward the orchid. "It will rot the roots." It was the beginning. He started joining her there, first as a silent observer, then as a reluctant instructor. He spoke of soil composition, of sunlight and shadow, his gruff pronouncements betraying a deep and passionate knowledge. In the quiet warmth of the glass house, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and burgeoning life, he began to talk. He spoke of the Blackwood estate, of the forests he had roamed as a boy, the rivers he had fished. He spoke of them as a man speaks of a lost limb, with a yearning so profound it was a physical ache in the air between them. For Alistair, every word was a torment. This woman's gentle spirit and guileless heart were the very things he had hoped to find, and the very things that made his deception a vile, corrosive poison in his soul. He had constructed this test, this prison of a chair, to shield himself from the fawning and the false. He had never imagined he would find someone so true, and that her truth would become his deepest shame. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a black lacquered carriage and the woman who emerged from it. Lady Beatrice, Alistair's aunt. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper words, her smile a thin, predatory slash in her powdered face. It was she who had orchestrated the parade of companions, all of them failing Alistair's silent, cruel test. She took one look at the easy rapport between her nephew and the commoner girl tending his plants, and her disapproval was instant and palpable. "My dear nephew," she purred, tapping his shoulder with a gloved finger. "I see you have found a new gardener. How quaint." She treated Alara with a cloying condescension, her compliments laced with venom, designed to remind Alara of her place. "You must be so very grateful for his grace's charity," she would say, her eyes glittering with malice. A few nights after her arrival, the acrid smell of smoke jolted Alara from a light sleep. A fire. Panic seized her as she ran into the corridor, which was already thick with gray haze. The fire was in the west wing, near the old library. As she tried to navigate the confusing maze of halls, a section of the ceiling, weakened by the heat, groaned and collapsed, a burning beam crashing down to block her path. She cried out, trapped between the smoke and the flames. Through the swirling chaos, she saw him. Alistair was there, his face a mask of raw terror. Not for the fire, not for his own safety, but for her. He propelled his chair forward with frantic power, his knuckles white on the wheels. For one heart-stopping moment, as he stared at the impassable barrier of fire between them, his entire body tensed. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, and Alara could have sworn he was about to rise. He was going to stand. The intent was so powerful it was almost a physical force. Then, 2 footmen appeared, their faces smudged with soot, and began heaving the beam aside. The moment was broken. Alistair surged forward the instant a gap was cleared, grabbing her arm, his grip like iron. He pulled her away from the flames, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wild with a fear that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with what he had almost done. The fire left the manor scarred but standing. It burned away the last of the emotional distance between them. In the aftermath, the unspoken was deafening. Lady Beatrice departed in a fury, her schemes thwarted by a near tragedy. Alone again, in the quiet sanctuary of the conservatory, Alistair finally broke. "It was not the fall that broke me," he confessed, his voice thick with unshed tears. He stared at his still hands, resting on the blanket that was his constant shield. It was the surviving. He told her of the ambush, the explosion, the faces of the men who had served under him, who had died while he had lived. His injury was real, but his recovery had been complete for years. The chair was a penance, fortress, a lie. He did not confess that last part, but the guilt of it radiated from him. "You see me, Alara," he whispered, finally looking at her, his soul naked in his eyes. "No one else has ever bothered to look past this chair. They see a title or a cripple. You see a man who likes orchids." The raw vulnerability in his voice undid her. The space between them collapsed, charged with all the words they could not say. He leaned forward, a slow, deliberate movement. She met him, rising onto her knees from the floor where she was tending a new bloom. His lips met hers, a tentative, desperate question. It was a kiss of profound sorrow and burgeoning hope, a merging of 2 lonely souls in a broken world. For Alistair, the sensation was dizzying. In her arms, he felt the ghost of his own 2 feet standing firm on the ground. The lie was a venomous serpent coiled at the heart of this perfect, impossible moment. He was holding the truth in his arms, and he was the most damnable liar on earth. Sleep offered no escape that night. The memory of the kiss, the intensity of his confession, the lingering mystery of his near miracle during the fire, it all churned within Alara. Anxious and restless, she slipped from her room and wandered the sleeping castle. A sliver of light from under a door drew her down a corridor she had never explored. The West Gallery. Alistair's man had once told her the Duke never went there. It held too many memories. Compelled by an instinct she couldn't name, she pushed the heavy oak door. It swung inward without a sound. The gallery was a vast, cavernous space, lined with shrouded furniture and smelling of dust and time. Rain lashed against the tall arched windows at the far end, and with each flash of lightning, the room was thrown into stark monochrome relief. And in the center of the room he stood, Duke Alistair, standing. His back was to her, his figure a tall, powerful silhouette against the storm-lit glass. He was not leaning on anything. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad and steady. As she watched, frozen in disbelief, he took a slow, deliberate step. Then another. He walked. He walked with the steady, measured gait of a man pacing out the dimensions of his own private hell. The world tilted on its axis. Every quiet moment, every shared confidence, every flicker of connection was instantly recast in the cold, harsh light of this deception. The shared vulnerability, the tragic story, the prison of his chair. All of it a lie, a cruel, elaborate test. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips, a sharp intake of breath that was louder than a scream in the echoing silence. He froze. For a terrible, stretched second he remained perfectly still. Then slowly he turned. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the guilt and raw horror on his face. He saw her, and the carefully constructed world he had built around himself disintegrated into dust. "Alara," he breathed, his voice a ragged shard of sound. The name was a blow. The betrayal was absolute, a torrent of ice water that extinguished the fragile warmth she had so carefully nurtured in her heart. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply turned and fled. She ran from the gallery, from the castle that was his gilded cage and her prison, from the man who had seen her soul and decided to play games with it. She packed nothing, taking only the worn cloak on her shoulders. On the small writing desk in her room, she left a single sheet of paper. On it 3 words, "I am not a test." Then she slipped out into the storm and disappeared. Alistair was left alone in the gallery, the echo of her gasp haunting the space around him. He sank to his knees, not from physical weakness, but from the crushing weight of his own monumental folly. The storm outside was a pale imitation of the one raging within him. He had sought a woman of true character, yet he had presented her with a fraud. He had yearned for authenticity and had offered only deceit. In his fear of being judged, he had become the most judgmental of all. The silence of the manor, once a comfort, was now his accuser. Alara found refuge in a small, bustling market town miles away. She took a room above a bakery, the scent of fresh bread a small, constant comfort. She found work as a seamstress, her nimble fingers a salvation. She mourned the man she thought she knew, the connection she thought she had forged, but her grief was edged with a steely resolve. Her heart was broken, but her spirit was not. She had dignity, and she would not allow his cruel game to diminish her worth. Weeks bled into a month. The town was preparing for its annual harvest fair, a jubilant celebration of community and bounty. The green was festooned with ribbons, the air filled with music and the smell of roasted nuts. Alara was there, a forced smile on her face, when a sudden hush fell over the crowd. A path parted through the throng of villagers, a wave of whispers and gasps following in its wake. Through the opening walked Duke Alistair. He was not in his chair. He walked slowly, deliberately, leaning on a simple, unadorned wooden cane. His face was thinner, the lines of grief etched deeper, but the cold arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling exhaustion. He ignored the stares, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. He stopped before her, in the center of the village green, under the judgment of hundreds of eyes. His aunt, Lady Beatrice, watched from a nearby pavilion, her face a mask of apoplectic fury. "I came here not to ask for your forgiveness," Alistair said, his voice clear and strong, carrying over the stunned silence. "That is a thing I have no right to request. I came to make a public confession, He looked not just at Alara, but at the assembled townsfolk. For years, I have hidden behind a lie. I used a past injury as a shield against the world, and as a cruel test for others. I was a coward, afraid of being seen for what I was. His gaze returned to Alara, and the raw honesty in them was searing. And then I met a woman who saw me anyway, a woman of such truth and integrity that my deception became unbearable. She was not a test. She was a lesson, and I failed her. He took a deep, shuddering breath. To begin to atone for my sins, I am this day signing over the deed and revenues of my northern estates to a trust, to be managed for the perpetual care of the families of the soldiers who fell beside me. It is a debt I should have paid long ago. He had not come to win her back. He had come to become a man who might have been worthy of her in the first place. Alara watched him, her heart a painful, fluttering thing in her chest. This was not the arrogant duke. This was not the deceitful recluse. This was a man laying his soul bare, performing an act of profound public penance. The grand gesture was not for her. It was for him, for the men he lost, for the truth. Slowly, she stepped toward him, closing the small distance between them. The crowd seemed to dissolve, the noise fading to a distant hum. There was only him standing before her, vulnerable and exposed. "Alistair," she whispered. At the sound of his name, spoken not with accusation, but with a fragile, dawning hope, something shifted in him. He straightened his shoulders, his back becoming ramrod straight. His hand, which had been gripping the cane, relaxed. He let it go. The simple wooden staff clattered to the grass, forgotten. The Duke, who could not walk, rose to his feet when the maiden whispered his name. He no longer needed the crutch, physical or emotional. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. They were warm, strong, and steady. "I am not a duke," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore. To you, I am only Alistair." A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, but she was smiling. "And I am Alara." In the heart of the village green, surrounded by the life he had once shunned, Alistair found his redemption not in a title or an estate, but in the steady, honest grip of a seamstress's hands. Their future would not be written in the cold stone of Blackwood Manor, but in the rich soil of the gardens they would one day tend together, a quiet, triumphant testament to a love that had been broken, and then, against all odds, had been earned.